This panel is part of a series of talks about what the new president, whoever she or he may be, will have to confront. One of those issues, obviously, is the relationship between the president and the judiciary and the impact of the judiciary on our national life. And we're fortunate to have a wonderful set of people to discuss this. I'm going to introduce the person very briefly who organized this panel and who will be the moderator. That's Professor John Yoo, who received his BA summa cum laude in American History from Harvard and his JD from Yale Law School, where he was the articles editor of the Yale Law Journal. He's clerked for Judge Silberman of the U.S. Court of Appeals of the D.C. Circuit, and then for the Supreme Court, where he clerked for Judge Thomas. He joined the Bolt faculty in 1993 and has been on our faculty since then, while also working for some years as the General Counsel of the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, and then in the Office of the Legal Counsel of the U.S. Department of Justice. His main areas of expertise are constitutional law, security law, and international law, and he has published widely in those areas. So, John, I'm going to leave it to you to introduce the panel and to take it from here.
Well, I just want to begin by saying, as my colleague Jesse Chopra asked me to say, to make clear to the audience that we're not here to talk about my prospects to join the Supreme Court. Jesse's of the fervent view that that will never happen in either of our lifetimes. So let me begin by introducing the panel. We have, I think, a really outstanding panel to discuss this important topic, the future of the federal courts and the 2008 elections. The first speaker, and we're going to go in alphabetical order, the first speaker is my colleague Jesse Chopra, who is the Warren Professor of Law and the former Dean of the Law School from 1982 to 1992. He clerked for Chief Justice Earl Warren, is the author of 2 important monographs and 2 casebooks used throughout the country, is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law Review, and most importantly, was just nominated and appointed to the California Horse Racing Commission.
He's the guy I want to know.
To Jesse's right is Professor Susan Estridge, who is a professor at the University of Southern California Law School, and before that was a professor at the Harvard Law School. I think she is probably known to many of you through a variety of appearances on Fox News as a legal and political analyst. You've also may have read her thoughts in a number of the nation's leading newspapers. She has been on the board of contributors to the Los Angeles Times and USA Today. She's had a distinguished career, including clerking for Justice Stevens of the Supreme Court, serving as a counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I think most relevant to our panel today, she served as a campaign manager for the Dukakis campaign, which was just one of a number of her experiences working on presidential campaigns over the last 20 years. She was a graduate of the Harvard Law School and was the first woman editor-in-chief of the Harvard Law Review and the author of several books. I think one of the most important books in the criminal law in the last 25 years called Real Rape, but then also most recently, The Case for Hillary Clinton. Directly to my right is Professor Bill Kelly at the Notre Dame Law School, where he's been teaching since 1995 and currently serves as the Associate Dean. He served as a Deputy White House Counsel from 2005 to 2007, where he worked on the confirmations of Justice Alito and Chief Justice Roberts. He served as an assistant in the Solicitor General's office from 1991 to 1994, and he has clerked for 3 federal judges, then Judge Starr of the D.C. Circuit, Chief Justice Berger, and Justice Scalia, and Bill is also, like Susan, a graduate of the Harvard Law School. So what we're going to do is give each panelist 15 minutes to discuss this issue. Then we'll have 15 minutes where they can respond to each other, and then we'll have 30 minutes of questions. So Jesse, please take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to talk about an interesting and obviously topical issue. This has been set up to have one person active in Democratic politics and one active in Republican politics, and I am the independent. And therefore, I'll try to give some overview. I know that the others are going to be wholly objective, but you can be wholly objective without being wholly dispassionate. I will be both, or at least try. Let me begin by saying that the realistic prospect, no matter who becomes president for the Supreme Court in the next 4 years, is unlikely, just unlikely, but to result in any change in what is in reality, and now has been for 3 years, not the Supreme Court, not the Roberts Court, but the Kennedy Court, because you have 4 right-leaning Supreme Court justices, and you have 4 left-leaning Supreme Court justices, and the successor to Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who held this position for 20 years at least, is Justice Anthony Kennedy. Right-leaning, but relatively less so as time goes on, and more important, the key swing vote on many, many volatile, controversial, and highly discussed issues, such as recently in the last term, on such issues as the right to an abortion, affirmative action in elementary and secondary education, the validity of provisions of the McCain-Feingold campaign regulation bill, and the list goes on. So why do I say it's unlikely? Well, I would say, as between the Republican, or let me just I'm just going to call them liberals and conservatives on the court. Between them, the liberals have the advantage or disadvantage of longevity and wisdom. When you're as old as I am, that's the way you think of being old. And indeed, Justice John Paul Stevens, and you'll forgive me for saying this, but in 1980, he's going to be 88 years old, and there is certainly a prospect of his, and probably of the justices, the stronger, if not the strongest prospect of being replaced if in the next 4 years. Let me say this, and Susan will probably talk more about it. He's certainly he's a role model for guys like me, and he also shows no inclination, in my judgment, to step down, no matter who becomes president, even though he sits in the liberal camp, and you can draw your own conclusions from that. So that's one of the 4 liberals on the court. The second oldest, and now it becomes pretty close in terms of age, but is often talked about, is Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's, 14 or 15 years his junior, Justice Stevens is junior, but nonetheless a couple of years older than anybody else. And the third, most interestingly, I guess, is Justice David Souter, who's by no means there in terms of age, but when people say, has given an indication that he's not happy with the current situation. There's no reason to believe that he'll be any happier the day after the election than he was the day before the election. I guess it's fair to say the liberals are in greater trouble in respect to the upcoming 4 years. The 3 most likely people who will be leaving the court in that period are among the 4 liberals. Now, that would give a conservative president an enormous advantage. It would be the advantage of changing a 5-4 court to a 6-3 court. And I am not a mathematician, but it is exponentially more difficult, at least on the basis of experience, if not mathematics, to get two of the right-leaning justices across the line. That being the case, as I said, that's what you got to look at when you're looking at the partisan composition of the court and what might happen with the next presidents. The second point that I want to make, and I fear that most of these are going to be obvious, but this is not a discussion tonight for deep philosophic insights, is the fact that the Senate is not as important as who the president will be, but is of substantial importance, as we have seen over the last 7, 8 years, and indeed more. You can go right into the Clinton administration and see the importance of that. If the president's party were to get 60 solid votes in the Senate, whichever the president's party will be, that makes a watershed difference in who can realistically not simply be nominated to the Supreme Court, but actually confirmed by the Senate. If not, and you have a president of one party and a majority, well, if you have 60 of the other party, it's all over. But if you have a majority of the other party, then the failure to have enough votes to get closure is quite meaningful and acts as a major bargaining chip, if you will, for the opposition party, and also has to play some role. For some presidents, I think less than others, certainly for the incumbent, it doesn't appear to have played any great role, but I'm sure it plays a role as to the kind of person you're going to nominate. It's one thing, as seemingly at least, it's a little early in their tenures, but it's one thing to get people like Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito through the Senate. It's another thing to get someone who has a much more openly partisan reputation on the basis, for example, of experience in the circuit. I think with less than 60 votes. So that becomes a very important consideration in what we're talking about. So both presidents are going to put some real premium on the following three criteria. These are for one who follows the situation, it's a no-brainers, but they're there. Some may put more or less than others, but number one is the gender of the nominee. A woman is certainly going to be looked at hard by both presidents to get someone who's acceptable and backed with some enthusiasm by the president in either party. Second is an Hispanic. This is a very large and growing minority group in the country. We have no Hispanic on the Supreme Court. And third would be an African American. Now, we have one woman and we have one African American, but we've had as many as two already. And there is a certain you owe one effect that's going to take place. I don't have much doubt about that. I guess well, whatever. I'm gonna leave it at that. So when you're thinking of who, but the potential people are, then the potential nominees are. You got to look hard at those three categories of people. Now let's look at the potential presidents. You know, it's pretty tame in a still contested. I mean, in what is it? February. I think you correct me if I'm wrong, but to have only three candidates for two positions is not terribly usual. Largely, you know, I think the consequence of these early primaries. But we know, you know, given some unforeseen act, that John McCain will be the Republican nominee. Well, what kind of people is he going to want to nominate to the Supreme Court? For Republicans in particular, and they're going to be the ones who are in charge of the White House if he gets elected, you know, he's playing a mixed bag. So the issue is, well, in which, I don't know whether it's the side of a bag or whatever it is, does a Supreme Court, the nomination of judges fall in? Well, he has the, again, advantage or disadvantage of not being a lawyer. And my instinct is, and others, I guess one of the reasons a moderate talks first, or a middle of the road, by no means moderate, but I am independent, is to state what I think there's a general public perception, and the insiders will tell us otherwise. My guess is he hasn't thought a lot. This is not. He said, you know, I'm going to appoint people like Scalia and Thomas a couple of times, but I think he knows even less about that, and has been concerned over the years even less than the incumbent, who said the same thing. Now, whatever he thought at the time, he's carried through pretty well with that commitment. I think a President McCain would rely very substantially on a group of advisors and have much less input than either of the Democratic nominees would have, to whom we're going to come in a moment. But having said that, I think he's going to lean on a conservative side in respect to this. This is not the sort of issue that he has had. You know, when immigration was an issue, he had thought a long time about it. When campaign finance was an issue, he had thought a long time about it. He said that I don't mean he said, his position has been that he's pro-life, but his position has also been that when it comes to judicial nominees, he was one of the gang of 14 that finally broke the logjam in the Senate, one of the 7, whatever they are, on each side. You know, one like moderates is one way of putting it. So he's interested in getting things done on this particular issue anyway. So I think he's going to nominate someone who's conservative, but I would say such a person would not be as conservative as the two opposing candidates who've fallen by the way, or the three for that matter. That is my own judgment. He's less committed on that issue. How about Obama and Clinton? I think there's very little difference between them in terms of criteria, generally, in terms of knowledge, and so forth. We don't know exactly how left-leaning Senator Obama is, but on general policy issues, there doesn't seem to be much difference between them. So far as Senator Clinton is concerned, that's another matter. She was quite active in judicial nominations in the White House. That is something that she was active about. And I think she was quite committed to people probably with more left-leaning inclinations than was the president, than Bill Clinton. That's just my own observation as an outsider. So I'm going to give you now, I have about 1 minute left, and I'll give you a quick list of some people who I think and I know a lot less than the other two folks here, who are likely nominees. So for the Republicans, if you start on the D.C. Circuit, there's Judge Janice Rogers Brown. A lot of people know who she is. She'd spark a lot of opposition. But with 60 votes, you can tolerate a lot of opposition. There's Judge Edith Clement on the Fifth Circuit. Her name, indeed, on the morning of the nomination, she was the pick, at least to the media.
She went to the hairdresser.
She went to the hair. And that is an important criterion you point out, right? Okay. And third on the Fourth Circuit, or at least recently on the Fourth Circuit, is Michael Luttig, who left the bench, but is a leading conservative. Fourth is Judge Jeff Sutton on the Sixth Circuit, very personable. He is a Roberts Alito type, in my judgment, in many, many ways. And fifth, I give you two non-judges, the Solicitor General, Paul Clement, and a sort of long shot is someone like Carter Phillips, who was a burger clerk, and I think fairly conservative, and he's a leading, if not the leading, Supreme Court advocate in the country. On the Democratic side, from the D.C. Circuit, David Tatel, Judith Rogers, and Merrick Garland. I think of the one Hispanic of the whole group, I guess, that I've named, is Judge Sonia Sotomayor on the Second Circuit, very highly respected. If you go to the Ninth Circuit, I got to think of Mrs. Clinton, and that will make a difference. Who do they know? Clinton versus Obama. Fletcher was appointed by President Clinton to the Ninth Circuit, and he was his campaign manager in Northern California when he ran for president, and was a what is the fellowship in Rhodes Scholar, yeah, co-Rhodes Scholar with President Clinton. And fourth are four law school deans or former deans. So I can say this, right? I'm not one of them. I have them here in alphabetical order. Our own dean here, Chris Edley, an African American, very active in the Obama campaign. Dean Elena Kagan at the Harvard Law School, someone who's been active in politics in the Clinton White House. Third is Harold Coase, the dean of the Yale Law School. I don't know where, someone will tell us where he's been as between Clinton and Clinton. And finally, former Dean Kathleen Sullivan, the Stanford Law School, who's also a Supreme Court advocate and so forth, and so on. So that's my list, and I think I may have gone over a few minutes, but nonetheless, I'm done.
Well done.
Susan.
I'll take any of those people on that last list. They're all my friends. I wanted to make a couple points. First of all, I wanted to describe, just by way of a funny story to start, how I ended up clerking for Justice John Paul Stevens, now viewed as the liberal on the court, but he wasn't back then. And it's a little instruction about how the court works. I was the then much younger, recently elected first woman president of the Harvard Law Review. And I went off to clerk for a man who changed my life. And really, that's what I'm here to talk about today and why I care about the federal judiciary. I went off to clerk for a man named J. Skelly Wright, who probably most of you in this room have never heard of. But he was a hero of another era. He integrated the Louisiana school systems. He integrated the New Orleans school system. He integrated LSU. He had crosses burned on his lawn so often that he used to say to his son in New Orleans, unless the cross is too close to the house, don't call your mother and I and bother us when we're out. You know, if it's close enough to the house to be a hazard, call the fire department. If it's not, ignore it. He had been appointed to the bench by Harry Truman. He made it to the D.C. Circuit because at the time in the 60s, the Southern Democrats who controlled the Judiciary Committee had made clear that they would not allow him to go on either the Fifth Circuit, which covered the South, or on the United States Supreme Court, even though he was like a few other judges of his time, John Minor Wisdom and all, really one of the men who changed America by their courage. So Jack Kennedy called him up and said, well, they tell me they're going to block you for the Fifth Circuit, and they tell me they're going to block you for the Supreme Court, so how about the D.C. Circuit? They say you'll stay out of trouble in the D.C. Circuit. So they appointed him to the D.C. Circuit, and no sooner did he get there, but he integrated the schools in the District of Columbia and issued the opinion that I read when I was a first-year law student called Williams versus Walker Thomas Furniture. I'll never forget it. I was a first-year student at Harvard where there was one side and there was the other side. It was all neutral and each side was equal. And then we sat down and read this opinion that said when you're selling furniture to poor people, you can't take advantage of the fact that they're poor to charge them usurious interest rates and then repossess the furniture. And I thought, this is a legal opinion? This is revolution. Who wrote this? And it was this J. Skelly Wright. So I went to work for him. He was a funny guy. He was a quiet man. He had gone to night law school. He was the most courageous person I ever met in my life. And he had this long tradition. He liked to have really smart law clerks because, as he said to me, I don't do the footnotes thing, you know. I do what's just, you do the footnotes. So he had figured out that the way to get great footnote writers was to hire, you know, the presidents of various prestigious law reviews and have them come and write his footnotes for him. So I got there my first day of work with my co-clerk, who had been the president of the University of Chicago Law Review. And I had filled out my applications for Supreme Court clerkships. And there was this long tradition in those days that if you clerked for Judge Wright and you were the president of the Harvard Law Review, you then immediately, without passing go, clerked for Justice William Brennan, the most liberal justice on the Supreme Court, my other hero from law school, the guy who had written the pioneering decisions on gender discrimination. You know, when you put a woman in a pedestal, you really put her on a cage, all that good stuff. So I was fine. I had my application in. The first day of work, Judge Wright called me into his chambers and said, I have some bad news for you, but I don't want you to take it personally. I said, okay. He said, you're not going to clerk for Justice Brennan, but it's nothing personal. I said, I'm not. He said, yeah, but it's not personal. I said, but he went to Harvard, and I went to Harvard, and he took my predecessor, and my predecessor's predecessor, and my predecessor's predecessor's predecessor. He said, it's nothing personal. He just doesn't hire women. I said, oh, nothing personal, right? And he didn't. It was the justice and the boys. Now, for those of you who are my age in this audience, you can remember these days. I mean, where do you go to when the most liberal justice of the United States Supreme Court won't hire you because you're a woman? He said, we'll find you another job. He's hiring your co-clerk from Chicago. I said, from Chicago? He's a conservative, right? I'm the liberal. No. As it turned out, and this is another day's event, the truth was that his secretary liked it to be Justice Brennan and the boys and her. And when Mrs. Brennan died, he married his secretary. And when he married his secretary, she retired and he started hiring women. And when he died, I started telling this story. But the point of the story is I turned to Judge Wright and said, who am I going to clerk for? He said, how about the new boy, Stevens? I said, I understand he's a conservative. He'd been on the Seventh Circuit. He'd issued a decision against women flight attendants. He said, give him a shot. He seems like a good young guy to me. Young, my age then. So I applied to Justice Stevens, who decided to get a jump on his colleagues by being the second person after Brennan to hire that year. And I went to see him, and we had this somewhat awkward conversation in which he was trying to figure out whether he was too conservative for me, and I was trying to figure out if I was too liberal for him. And we figured, what the hell, we'll give this a shot. Well, that was 30 years ago. And I have remained very close to him over the years. And I say to him laughingly all the time that when I get introduced at forums like this, everybody says, well, she used to clerk for Justice Stevens. And people say, well, of course, the liberal justice. And I have to explain to them, he wasn't the liberal justice back then. It took a lot of work. And I used to say to him in recent years, what's happened? How is it that you and I have ended up in the same place? He said, the rest of the world has moved. And I think, unfortunately, there is some truth to that. Has Justice Stevens moved so far to the left, or has the court moved so far to the right? And I think the frank reality from where I sit, having been in this business for 30 years, is that Justice Stevens has moved some. On issues like the death penalty, for instance, he has definitely been shaped by his experience of seeing the way cases are handled on the court. But in a very real way, the court has moved. And one of the reasons the court has moved is because in my other life, running political campaigns, and John was very generous, he only mentioned one of my losers. I have many losers. Every Democrat you ever voted for in your life who lost, I worked for. I did 2 successful Clinton campaigns, but I did Kennedy, I did Carter, I did Mondale, I did Ferraro, I did Dukakis. I mean, I've been there, right? And in every one of those campaigns, I have tried, from a position of some significance, to make the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary a voting issue. I have tried, I cannot tell you how many speeches I have written in 30 years about, from presidential candidates saying, you're not just voting for me, you're voting for the next Supreme. I've done the ads with the pictures of the who will fill these seats, and it never works. It's like trying to get people to vote for vice president. They don't. So the problem, and one of the interesting things to me about this subject tonight, is that from where I sit, who appoints not just the Supreme Court, because I want to raise the issue, and that's the reason I began with Judge Wright, of the federal judiciary going beyond the Supreme Court. Who appoints those people, and who those people are critically important to the freedoms we have as Americans and to the freedoms others have who live in this country and are subject to our laws here and abroad. But try to turn it into a voting issue, and it's like banging your head against a brick wall. I have polled it, I have tested it, I have focus grouped it, I have done ads on it, and I have never, when you see a Supreme Court ad on television, it's like seeing the one heartbeat away from the presidency ad. You know the candidate's got troubles because they haven't got a winning issue. And that's really too bad, because it seems to me we are at a very, very critical time. Everybody focuses on the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is vitally important. But I would make the argument that the most significant thing the next president is going to do may not be to replace Justice Stevens with, hopefully, one of my friends, a former law school dean like Chris Edley, who was my classmate and office mate and very close friend, or Elena Kagan or Kathleen Sullivan, all good friends of mine, all would be wonderful justices. It would be a mitzvah. But the real issue is who's going to appoint these federal district judges and federal courts of appeals judges. And are they going to be people of courage? I have just spent the last couple years, and I'm still at it, I'm on a red eye tonight to go back and bang my head against the wall some more, representing a Muslim in Boston who never had anything to do with terrorism, but he's a Muslim in Boston, who's been convicted on tax counts owing to a charity he founded 17 years ago when he was a graduate student that hasn't been in existence for God knows how many years. And I have found myself in the federal district courts against prosecutors who, with all due respect, are convinced they are doing the Lord's work in depriving people of fundamental liberties. And our only hope is courageous district judges. And I really do believe that I may not be able to turn it into a voting issue, and it may not make for a great ad, but we are in another one of those time periods, not so different from the time period when J. Skelly Wright was sitting in New Orleans with the crosses burning on his lawns, when it is necessary to appoint men and women of courage and determination and integrity to stand up for fundamental rights that are endangered by the war on terror. And so I would simply say to you, as you think about this next election, that to me is very much at stake, and it's more at stake in the day-to-day decisions that are made by federal judges about how cases get tried and who gets detained and how these things are processed, and made by courts of appeals, than by the relatively, frankly, small handful of decisions that get made by the United States Supreme Court. And as for me, while I've known Hillary Clinton for 30 years and like her enormously, and am frankly deeply troubled by some of the sexism, dare I say it, that I see out there, I think Barack Obama is an exciting and inspirational candidate, and I am at least optimistic, cautiously optimistic, for somebody who has been through 99 losing campaigns. I am cautiously optimistic that some of my friends, some of my former students, maybe some of the people sitting in this room will have an opportunity to show some courage in coming years, which is what we desperately need on the federal bench. Thank you very much.
Throughout my adult life, every presidential election, everyone says, this election is crucial for the history of the Supreme Court. I don't remember any election where that wasn't true, and I believe it's true again. There's no question in a world where judicial power is so important and so prominent that who sits on the Supreme Court is a very important thing in our republic. And it's likely, I agree with Jesse, that the next president will fill several seats. Everyone always says that, and somehow it doesn't seem to happen. But odds are at least one, and I would guess more than one appointment will be made by the next president, whoever it is. And I've recently come off an experience where I had some role in helping the president decide whom he was going to pick and then how to get those people confirmed. So I'm going to say just a few words about that process and the importance of certain factors in the process, regardless of who's president. The most important thing, I think, that any president has to take account of in making decisions about whom he or she is going to appoint to the Supreme Court is really excellence in the nominee. And there's no substitute for absolute professional distinction in whomever the nominee is. It's very difficult for forces aligned against the president, regardless of whatever party the president is from, to successfully oppose a nominee whose professional distinction is really unquestionable. It's just the way the dynamic works. It has worked so far, at least. And in the case of Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito, there was no way, really reasonably, a person could question their excellence. And that was shown, I think, as well during their confirmation hearings when they performed, well, awesomely. And that made it very difficult for those opposing the nominations to get the traction they needed and the political momentum to stop these people from being confirmed. And particularly with Chief Justice Roberts, that was very clear early on, because the interest groups interested in judicial nominations are going to be opposed to the president's pick either side, almost regardless. If that's not the case, then the president's supporters, regardless of which party the president's from, are going to be disappointed in the nominee. And it's unlikely that the next president will disappoint his or her supporters in these picks because they're so important and thought to be and acknowledged to be so important. So the key is not to worry about focused interest group opposition to nominees. The key is to make sure that the reasonable middle and the media don't latch on to the objections. And if a nominee is professionally excellent and unquestionably so, of unquestioned ethics, of unquestioned integrity, unquestioned professionalism, collegiality, it's very hard for the media and for the people who are open-minded about these matters in the political world to take them down. And I think that explains the confirmation of Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito. It was a remarkable thing to witness that both of these men, who were obviously very accomplished lawyers and judges, who had served at the highest levels of the legal profession, who had been ambitious, obviously, by definition they're ambitious people, and you couldn't find one person anywhere to say one bad thing about either of them. It's a remarkable thing. It's almost hard to believe. But it wasn't like people didn't look. And I think that really explains why they were confirmed. And I think, unfortunately, it also explains how the traction against the nomination of Harriet Miers became so strong, because she was perceived to be of less excellence, wrongly in my own view. But nonetheless, she was perceived not to have the excellence that we now demand of Supreme Court justices. This is a new development in our system. It didn't used to be the case that Supreme Court justices had to be legal giants. Many were politicians. No one, with all due respect, would have described Chief Justice Warren as a legal giant. He was a political giant, and he turned into a legal giant as Chief Justice of the United States. But today, someone with Chief Justice Warren's background would face serious objections on the merits in the process. And it's interesting to hear my colleagues up here talk about potential nominees, and among them people who aren't sitting judges. I am personally, my own view is that non-sitting judges ought to be considered, and it would be a good thing to open up the field of Supreme Court appointments to people who aren't boring Court of Appeals judges. But it's going to be hard to do that successfully. I think it's going to be very hard to get law school deans, even of the distinction of Dean Edley or Dean Sullivan or Dean Kagan, through the process, because although they're professionally excellent, they're different and they're not our image of Supreme Court justices anymore. And I think that's going to be a hurdle to overcome. We're also going to be on the record on lots of controversial issues, which will provide ammunition to those who might oppose their nominations. And I don't count myself among those who would oppose, I'm not taking any position on the nomination of any person. But it's inevitable that whoever the president is, there's going to be opposition to his or her nominations. Professional excellence, I think, is the key. It also is very important to have support in the Senate. The role of the Senate in the judicial process, the judicial nomination and confirmation process, both at the inferior court level and the Supreme Court level, is just crucially important. I agree with Susan about this point. It wasn't nothing, obviously, that the Republicans had 55 seats in the Senate when Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito went through the process. Now, Jesse has said that 60 votes is a key marker in the process of picking and confirming a justice, and that's true, but it didn't really used to be true. We don't have a tradition in this country of filibustering judicial nominations of any sort, and particularly Supreme Court nominations. Requiring a cloture vote on a Supreme Court nominee is an extraordinary thing. It's happened now twice, and once it was a serious objection, and it was a serious issue when Justice Fortas was nominated to be Chief Justice. They did require a cloture vote for Justice Alito's confirmation, but it didn't get a lot of traction. My own view is that it's not a good thing for the system to escalate to that level. And we're at a point where neither side defers in any way to the president's prerogatives in judicial appointments. That's true of both Republicans and Democrats. And we've seen an escalation in the last 15 years of tactics opposing judges' confirmations because we tend now to perceive them as having more of a political role than a legal role than they used to have. And I'm going to say a few words about lower court nominations. There's no question that in the day-to-day administration of justice in this country, the judges on the courts of appeals and the district courts have enormously important influence and much more day-to-day influence than Supreme Court justices. And who fills those seats is obviously very important. There's a huge distinction, though, between Court of Appeals nominations and district court nominations, and that does involve the role of the Senate. For district court nominations, the incumbent president is bound to listen very closely to the interests and desires of home state senators. And it's the Senate's practice that without the agreement of both home state senators for a district court nominee, that nomination dies. So if you want judges of courage who will give you results that you like, it's very important to work on the Senate side on a state-by-state basis. And indeed, in some ways, more important than worrying about the president. The truth is that home state senators have as much influence over district court nominations as does the president. On the Court of Appeals side, and I think this is true of judicial nominations generally, it's very important not only who the president is, but who the president's staff is. Different presidents organize judicial selection in different ways, and I don't know how Senator McCain or Senator Obama or Senator Clinton would organize judicial selection. But there's no doubt, of course, that the president is going to take advice on these matters. It can't be otherwise, at least practically speaking. Probably less true of Supreme Court nominations, and I think particularly I agree on the Democratic side. I think either candidate will have his or her own views on those matters independently of whatever the staff might think. I don't think that's true of Senator McCain. I agree about that. But who the staff is matters. Now, if Senator Obama becomes president, it won't matter because everyone's going to agree on everything and it will be a consensus and all will be wonderful in the world. So it doesn't matter actually so much who his staff is. But in fact, I got to say, I'm guessing that Senator Obama's staff, if he becomes president, will be partisan Democrats, even if he's not. I actually believe he is, of course, and he would agree, I'm sure, if he was here. It's just a different kind of partisanship. His staff should be partisan Democrats, and that's the way it ought to be. And they're going to have their own views about who would be good judicial candidates, and that's important in advising any president. And that's true of whoever, obviously, the president is. So when we think about not only who the president is, the way the executive branch is staffed is as important. There's enormous work to be done in the executive branch in the departments and agencies, and the staff that the president brings has enormous influence, therefore. On the confirmation side, on the lower courts, I think describing the need for lower court judges to be people of courage is exactly right. Now, we might disagree, Susan and I, about what that means in particular cases. Any president really needs to be focused on making sure that whoever the judges become are people who are going to be true to their oaths, who are going to decide the cases on the merits, who aren't going to be cowed by public pressure, who are going to be independent judicial actors. Now, obviously, a Republican president or a Democratic president are going to expect and look for different judicial philosophies, approaches to law. But they oughtn't to be looking, I think, for particular outcomes and results. They should be looking for judges who will decide the cases according to their best lights, regardless of who the parties are and regardless of what the issues are. In the Court of Appeals confirmation wars of the last 15 years, we've seen a degradation of relations, and that's a new and different thing. You know, it is true that throughout our history, there have been numerous Supreme Court nominations that have failed in the Senate. It's really only in the last generation that on inferior court nominations, there's been concerted opposition to the president's picks, regardless of party. The Republicans misbehaved during the Clinton administration, delayed some folks for too long, unconscionably. But they didn't vote anybody down on the Court of Appeals level, as a matter of fact. Nobody was not confirmed who got a vote. There were some who were left unconfirmed, as had been the case with President Bush 41's judicial nominees and President Clinton's and President Carter's, except for Stephen Breyer, of course, who remarkably was nominated and confirmed to the First Circuit after President Carter lost the election.
I did his pick.
There you go. Well, just consider. Yeah, exactly. Consider where we are. Consider where we are in the Court of Appeals context when 28 years ago we have a excellent nominee to the First Circuit nominated and confirmed after the incumbent president and his party have lost the election. That is a remarkable thing, and obviously it couldn't possibly happen today. Well, yes.
I was there.
But of course, the Republicans didn't believe that it was essential to stop that because the perceived role of the Court of Appeals judge was not just to do whatever political bidding of the day was afoot. And beginning in, I think, the Bush years, well, really the Reagan years, there was more focus on judicial lower court nominations. And then in the Clinton years, things degraded. And then in the Bush 43 years, things degraded even more. The first set of Court of Appeals nominees submitted by President Bush included two nominees of President Clinton, one of whom had been recess appointed to the Fourth Circuit, Roger Gregory. Now, in the world of interbranch relations, recess appointment of a judge, a Court of Appeals judge, is extremely impolite. It's about as impolite as things get. And still, he was nominated and confirmed very quickly. But that was the high watermark. And I have to say, and maybe this is a partisan point, that gesture by President Bush was not met in kind. And within a couple years, we had 10 filibustered Court of Appeals nominees, which was unprecedented in the history of the Republic. And we're at a point now, if a Democrat wins the White House, where we really need to decide how to stand down. I don't see how it can happen, because interest groups are involved, and a lot's at stake, and it's very hard to lay down arms in this kind of battle. The final point I'll make is about the politics of judicial selection. It is the case, I think it's accurate, and obviously Susan is extremely experienced in these matters, and I'm not, that people don't vote on judges as an issue. But they did in 2002 in the Senate campaign. And the Democratic perceived obstructionism of the Court of Appeals nominees is widely thought, and I think properly thought, to have been a significant factor in the Democrats' loss of the Senate in that election, and particularly in the majority leader of the Senate's loss of his reelection, Senator Daschle from South Dakota. And this is an issue, judges, that does tend to energize Republicans, I think, more than Democrats. At least that is my perception. I don't know why that is, because I also perceive that Democrats tend to want more from judges than Republicans. Republicans, the conventional wisdom is, want judges to be conservative and decide according to the law. That's what they'll say. And Democrats, of course, will say they want them to decide according to the law as well. But according to the law, tends to be outcomes that they like. And for some reason, it doesn't energize Democratic voters the way it does, it seems, at least in recent years, seems to have energized Republican voters. I think in this coming election, it's possible that there will be more traction on this question, although I have to guess I do have to defer to the greater wisdom of Professor Estridge on these questions. So I'll stop there and say that I don't know who the president's going to be, obviously, but one thing is clear: whoever it is, the action is going to be in the United States Senate. Thank you.